The History of Poland Podcast, Episode 53, The Founding of the Jagiellonians. Hello and welcome back. Last time, we did a very brief overview of the history of Lithuania up to the point when it became politically advantageous for Lithuania to unite with another state. Today we're going to talk about the early days of this union. This is going to be a bit of a turning point in the podcast. Up to this point, we really followed the Piast dynasty rather than the entire political fabric of Poland. From here on out, the Piasts effectively ceased to matter. Sure, there are plenty of Piasts still around, but the time of them being the only people ruling, or even being the head of the ruling dynasty, has passed. Instead, we enter into a new dynasty, a new political fabric that is more complicated than the old, new land to talk about, new rivals, and a new direction. Not only is that going to impact the topics we cover, but it's also going to impact the format of the show. I'm not totally sure how yet, but I'm sure it'll be interesting when we get to it. Anyway, the early days of the Union were complicated and in flux for a period of decades, which is not a big surprise. I mean, imagine if you were a part of one country today, and then you and another country decided to just merge. Sure, it could happen, but it's not going to be a seamless process. There will be people upset with the idea. Those who love the idea but hate its implementation, and those who have issues that only become apparent over time. There are political concerns, religious concerns, border concerns, arguments over trade, taxes, and the rights of people. No, just the rights of the nobility, and differences in every other subject that is the focus of a government. All of this complication, for Poland and Lithuania at least, starts with the Union of Crave. As we talked about last week, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, who I'll now be calling by his Polish and more widely used name, Władysław Jagiełło, was in a precarious position. It was becoming clear that Lithuania would only struggle if it continued on its own, but at the same time, finding the right partner would be difficult at best. To solve his and Lithuania's problems, Władysław entered into a pact with the Polish nobility. This pact is known to us as the Union of Crave. At its most basic level, the Union of Crave is an exchange of promises between Władysław and his brothers and the rulers of Poland. Władysław would agree to convert both himself and Lithuania to a Roman Catholic nation. They would turn over all historically Polish lands back to Poland. They'd release all Polish prisoners of war and would pay the Duke of Austria 200,000 gold florins. Now, why did Władysław agree to pay the Duke of Austria 200,000 florins, which in today's terms would be at the very least tens of millions of 2020 US dollars? Well, it's because in exchange for all of his promises on behalf of Lithuania, Władysław would marry Jadwiga, Queen of Poland, who, awkwardly, was already engaged to the Duke of Austria. There are two schools of thought, or rather two major schools of thought. There's also a school of thought that this whole thing didn't actually happen, but that's been pretty much debunked. Anyway, there are two schools of thought about the importance of the Union of Crave. The first is that this was a world-changing agreement that would immediately change the political landscape of Europe in a way that impacted all political strategies. The second is that this was just a minor agreement that didn't amount to much. As always, I think it's probably between the two, and I lean a little bit more towards the second one, with a teaspoon of the first thrown in. The reason is that, while it's undeniable that an agreement like this was unique and brought Poland and Lithuania closer together, the truth is that there were also going to be a number of additional agreements made over the next few decades to further solidify the relationship. When taken in total, the series of agreements, the Union of Crave, the Pact of Vilnius and Radom, and the Union of Horodło, would certainly be classified as world-changing. But this was just the first of the series. Which isn't to say that the Union of Crave didn't matter. It did. In one particular area. It meant that Władysław would now marry Jadwiga. Now, skipping right past the general ickiness of a 12-year-old being married over to a 32-year-old, on a political level, the marriage meant that Władysław would now be the ruler of both Poland and Lithuania. As ruler of both Poland and Lithuania, Władysław had a lot to deal with. But foremost among the problems was securing his authority to rule. While he may have had the support of the nobility of Poland with their general hunt for a great new ruler, he still had to reckon with his base of support in Lithuania proper. To secure his power there, Władysław sent his brother to rule in his stead. Sadly, while his brother was loyal, he was not particularly effective. Instead of securing the territory and making sure the base of Władysław's authority remained firm, he ended up alienating much of the Lithuanian nobility. The nobility found comfort in the welcome embrace of Władysław's cousin, Vytautas. Vytautas then used the support of the nobility to launch a civil war with the aim of supplanting Władysław and becoming Grand Duke of Lithuania. This was not the first time Vytautas and Władysław had gone to war, and they both had a good estimate of each other's strength. So I'm not totally sure what they were expecting when the hostilities kicked off. But whatever they expected, I'm sure they were both disappointed, because the conflict quickly turned bitter and destructive and with no clear end in sight. Instead, it was just resulting in the destruction of property. Fortunately, if there's one thing we know, the destruction of property is going to get people's attention and lead to a resolution. As such, the two sides got together and signed the Ostrov Agreement in 1392. This agreement allowed Vytautas to rule Lithuania as Grand Duke, but to do so with Władysław as his overlord. As the years passed, Vytautas very much ruled Lithuania independently, and it's quite likely that he was biding his time before just ignoring Władysław altogether. Sadly for Vytautas' ambitions, these plans were forcibly shelved when he was defeated at the Battle of Vorskla River by the Golden Horde of the Mongols in 1399. And it wasn't even just a small defeat, it was like a crushing defeat. So, due to this defeat, Władysław suddenly had the upper hand in any future negotiations with Vytautas. Using this leverage, the two agreed to the Pact of Vilnius-Radom in 1401. This pact built on the agreements made in both the Ostrov Agreement and in the earlier Union of Crave. In general, it tidied up the political situation in both Poland and Lithuania. In short, it dealt with some of the complications of this relatively new world everyone was working to build. First, it dealt with the sad reality that Jadwiga, Queen of Poland and much beloved figure, had died giving birth to a child in 1399 at the age of 25, and there was no heir from the marriage, which meant that Władysław suddenly had no real claim to rule Poland as king unless the nobility went along with him. Second, it dealt with the fact that neither Władysław nor Vytautas had a legitimate heir to succeed them on their deaths to either respective office. And finally, it dealt with the reality that there were bigger fish to fry than who was in charge, and that there was more than enough land for both of them to rule together. After all, let's not forget the Teutonic Knights are still around and not super thrilled with this union. The terms of the pact were simple. Władysław would remain king, Vytautas would remain Grand Duke, and on Vytautas' death, the rule of Lithuania would revert to Władysław and his descendants. The agreement was made not just by the two men, but also by an assembly of Polish nobles, and separately by an assembly of Lithuanian nobles. Everyone was very excited about the future. And then, wouldn't you know it, foreign powers and the rabble decided to mess things up. Sometimes tidy pieces of paper are not all that's needed to resolve major geopolitical issues. Sometimes you need to get into the mud. The issue that came up was over the territory of Semijitia. To give you a brief history, the land, which was part of Lithuania, had been granted to the Teutonic Order by Vytautas in exchange for their support in various military endeavors. Great, sounds fine. Land in exchange for help. Only problem is that the people who lived there didn't want to be ruled by the Teutonic Order. They wanted to remain in Lithuania, which is kind of awkward to say the least. So, throughout the first decade of the 1400s, there were a number of uprisings in Semijitia. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise that Vytautas and the Lithuanian leaders supported the Semijitians in these revolts. And it also shouldn't come as much of a surprise that Władysław and Poland followed Lithuania's lead on this one. And all of this, again, to no surprise, very much ticked off the Teutonic Order. One thing led to another, and wouldn't you know it, everyone's at war. Wait a second, I hear you saying. The Teutonic Order is going to war with Poland and Lithuania? Why? I thought that Poland and the Teutonic Order were on good terms following the Treaty of Kalisz. And I thought that Lithuania was now a Christian state and not subject to crusades anymore. Isn't the Teutonic Order only supposed to go to war against people who are opposing the crusades? What's even going on here? All very good questions, my friend. What's going on here is a thing that's called realpolitik. As Ludwig von Rachau stated when he defined the term in the 1850s, quote, "The study of the forces that shape, maintain, and alter the state is the basis of all political insight and leads to the understanding that the law of power governs the world of states just as the law of gravity governs the physical world." End quote. That's realpolitik, and no matter what the religious dogma says, that was the modus operandi of the Teutonic Order during its twilight years. The Teutonic Order looked on the new union of Poland and Lithuania with a bit of anger and malice, maybe jealousy too. After all, the order existed to pursue crusading, And since they had already conquered everyone around them that wasn't subject to crusades, namely non-Christians, and they were an expansionist state that depended on the revenue collected from war-making, the order was very much locked into its struggle for control of Lithuania. Sure, they might have said the right words about doing it for the benefit of the Vatican, and sure, they might have attracted people to fight for them out of an authentic sense of piety and dedication to their faith. But at the end of the day, they were there to fight and conquer territory for the benefit of the order and the order alone. I mean, what else are they going to do? Just sit around crocheting all day? So, when the union started to form between Poland and Lithuania, the Teutonic Order tried to undermine it. They tried to convince the Pope that the conversion of Władysław and his compatriots was a sham, that they were really still practicing their pagan heathen ways. Then they claimed that there were still pagans in Lithuania, even if the rulers had authentically converted. Then they spread rumors that Jadwiga had consummated her marriage with the Duke of Austria before marrying Władysław, and as such, the marriage and union were invalidated. Everything they could think of they tried. They knew that if they didn't break the alliance and continue to have territory ripe for conquest, they'd soon wither and die. So, as I was saying before you so rudely interrupted, one thing led to another, and wouldn't you know it, everyone is at war. This war, the Polish-Lithuanian Teutonic War, started in August of 1409. After a 9-month truce, Poland and Lithuania were ready to fight, as was the Teutonic Order. A full-fledged battle was called for. With at least tens of thousands of people on the field, the numbers are a little questionable depending on who you look to, the two sides met between the towns of Tannenberg and Grunwald, which is modern-day Grunwald. As the Oxford History of Poland-Lithuania tells us of the battle, quote, Tannenberg was a large battle by 15th century standards. Both armies were armed and equipped in the latest Western style. The core of each force comprised armored knights, with the order deploying field artillery. The Lithuanian army, containing Lithuanians, Ruthenians, and a Tatar unit, was largely light cavalry in the Eastern style. The battle's outcome demonstrated the old military truth that, on the whole, larger armies defeat smaller forces. In its initial phase, the Lithuanians on the Union's army's right engaged first. After fierce fighting, they withdrew from the battlefield. Whether this was a planned maneuver or a flight is disputed. Although there is good cause for skepticism concerning the ability of such a large force to accomplish such a complex tactic after an hour of hard fighting, one contemporary source suggests that some units, possibly the Tatars, may indeed have deliberately retreated. Whatever the reality, Vytautas rallied some of his Lithuanians and returned to the battlefield, where the Polish army, together with 3 Ruthenian banners from Smolensk, still enjoyed a sufficient numerical advantage to give it the upper hand. After several hours of fighting, the Order's army was shattered. Jungingen, Grand Marshal Wallenrode, and virtually all the Order's senior officers were killed, as were between 203 and 211 out of the 270 brothers of the Order who fought, out of a total of some 570 then active in Prussia. End quote. So, that is what I would call a shockingly decisive battle. The result of so decisive a victory? Not a ton. Of course, the Teutonic Knights had lost, but they had also won the battle for the minds of Europe, or at least their allies. That's because the victory was so crushing, it spurred the Order's allies in Western Europe to flock to its banner and defend the Order against the Poles and only recently converted Lithuanians. Eventually, due to the stalemate, an agreement was signed, the Peace of Thorn, that temporarily resolved some of the issues between Poland, Lithuania, and the Order. These terms were only temporary, though, and it wasn't until 2 subsequent, though substantially smaller, wars in 1414 and 1422 that the conflict over Samogitsia was finally resolved with the Treaty of Melno. It wasn't a permanent peace, but it was peaceful enough that it allowed Lithuania to focus on domestic reforms and stop worrying about what the Order was up to. This relative peace allowed Poland and Lithuania to continue to draw closer together. It also coincided with the Polonization of Lithuania, where leading Lithuanian families were granted Polish coats of arms, and where Lithuanian and Polish clergy began to coordinate their activities more closely. These may seem like small acts, but they would eventually lead to a shared culture between the two states that would bear fruit for many years to come. For Władysław, the years were focused on continuing to solidify his rule. After yet another marriage, he had 2 legitimate sons, Władysław of Varna and Casimir Andrew. That was one thing taken care of. Then, after the death of Vytautas at the ripe old age of 80, Władysław was focused on controlling Lithuania, eventually leading to his preferred candidate for Grand Duke to wage a civil war in Lithuania, and following that to the Polish-Teutonic War of 1431 to 1435. While there's plenty to talk about in all of this, we're all familiar with the broad outlines of these kinds of conflicts. So instead of rehashing all of the details of this conflict, I'll just say that it ended with a peace treaty that finally put a stop to the Teutonic Order's meddling in Polish and Lithuanian affairs. Sadly, Władysław didn't live to see that treaty signed since he died in 1434 at the age of 82. His sons would go on to rule after him, but that's a story for another time. Władysław's reign would echo for centuries, not least because his name became that of the dynasty that followed him, the Jagiellonians. He oversaw the early stages of unification between Poland and Lithuania, helped to establish a new line to rule Poland, and dealt decisive blows against the longtime enemies of both states with his victories over the Teutonic Order. It was an influential reign, and although it wasn't without issue, it was on the whole to the benefit of Poland that Władysław ruled during this time. It's very difficult to imagine somebody doing a better job. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. We'll pick up next time with Władysław's sons, with the continued integration of the two states, and with a new dynasty. So long, PS. It's been a blast. As always, a big thank you to all of the patrons that made this episode possible. You've really been a big help in funding this show, especially now with all the new books that need to be purchased for the next phase of this podcast. If you'd like to join their ranks, you can do so at patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.